The chapel at Norrie's Cross was full to the rafters, and not one soul in it expected the woman in the grey travelling cloak who stood at the back and would not sit down. The morning light came slant through the tall windows and lay in long bars across the stone floor, gilding the lilies banked at the altar, gilding the gold thread in the bride's gown, gilding everything but the woman by the door, who had chosen her place where the light did not reach. She held a flat leather case against her chest, with both gloved hands. The organ had stopped. The Reverend had begun the words that bound two people for the length of their lives, and he had reached the part that asks whether any present know of a lawful impediment, the part that no one ever answers, the part that is only ever a held breath before the rest of the morning. The held breath came. The woman by the door stepped forward into the bar of light, and the case in her hands caught the gold of it, and she said in a voice that did not shake, that she did. A wedding is a machine for producing certainty, and certainty does not like to be interrupted. For a moment, nobody moved. The Earl of Edenbrook stood at the altar in a coat of deep navy with a white cravat folded high at his throat, and he did not turn at once the way a man does not turn toward a sound he has already decided not to have heard. The bride turned faster. Sabria Lawley turned in a rustle of pale gold silk, and her face, which had been arranged into the soft confidence of a woman who has at last got the thing she was promised, came undone at the edges and then composed itself again quickly, like water closing over a dropped stone. She had seen the woman by the door. She had hoped never to see her in this room. What the congregation saw was a governess. They could all of them have told you what she was, within a breath of looking at her, because the marriage market is a school in which everyone is fluent, and a plain gray cloak worn over a gown 2 seasons out of fashion is a sentence anyone can read. To the county, Idany Rayfield was a woman who taught other women's children their letters and their globes and their French verbs, who took her dinner on a tray and her wages once a quarter, who would marry a curate if she were lucky, and no one at all if she were not. The county had decided what she was before she spoke. The county was about to learn that it had been wrong about a great many things, and that the woman in gray had come a very long way to teach it. Let me tell you something before the morning goes further, because you will want to hold it, as you watch what comes. The case in her hands was not empty, and the certificate inside it was not a forgery, and she had not come to ruin a wedding. She had come to prevent a crime. The difference between those two things would take the whole of the day to make plain, and it would cost her more than she had told anyone, and she would pay it without flinching, because she had been paying for 3 years already and had learned the price. To understand why a governess stood at the back of a chapel with a leather case held to her heart, you must go back, as she had gone back 100 times in the dark, to a small parish 3 counties distant, and a different church, and a colder season. 3 years before, Idany had not been a governess at all. She had been the only daughter of a clergyman of modest living and modest expectation, a man who loved his books and his bees and his one clever child, and who taught her Latin because there was no one else in the house to teach it to. She had been 21. She had been quiet in the way that watchful people are quiet, and she had been clear-eyed, and she had loved a man entirely beneath the notice of the world and entirely above her own station, and he had loved her back, which was the impossible part. The part she still could not say aloud without something closing in her throat. The man was Almeric, though she had not known at first that the lean, tired traveler who took shelter in her father's study from an October rain was anyone in particular. He had been riding north on his own affairs with a single servant, and a thrown shoe and a broken storm had brought him to the parsonage door, and he had stayed 2 nights, and then, because a man may invent reasons when his heart has already decided, he had stayed 11. He sat in her father's study, and argued Virgil with her across the hearth. He learned the names of the bees. He watched her hands as she mended a torn page, and something in his still face moved that she did not have a word for. And on the 12th morning he told her who he was, and that he was promised by his late father's arrangement to a girl he had met 4 times, and that he could not, having sat 11 evenings in this room, go north and marry her. What he proposed was not respectable, and he knew it, and he laid it before her with the level honesty she would come to know as the truest thing about him. He could not bring her to his world as a clergyman's daughter without title or fortune. His family would unmake it. His aunt, who held the purse and the family's whole consequence in her two ringed hands, would crush the match before the bands were dry, and would crush Idony with it, and would not scruple at the means. So he asked her to marry him in quiet here, in her own father's parish, with her father's hand to do it, and 2 honest souls to witness, and to wait. He would put his affairs in order. He would free himself of the northern arrangement by the slow, lawful means it required. He would come back for her before a 12-month was out, and bring her home as his wife in the daylight, and let his aunt do her worst, because a marriage made cannot be unmade by anyone's displeasure. She had said yes. Of course she had said yes. They were married on a gray afternoon in November in the small cold church, where she had been christened by her own father, whose hands shook on the book not from age, but from the size of what he was doing for his child. There were 2 witnesses. One was a girl named Olwen Cruse, who had been in service at the parsonage since she was 12, and who loved Idony as an elder sister is loved by a younger, and who signed the register in a careful, square, painstaking hand because she had taught herself her letters late, and was proud of everyone. The other was the parish clerk, an old man now dead. The reverend who joined them was Idony's father, and when it was done, Amalric had given her a folded paper, the certificate written out in her father's own hand, and signed, and sealed, and dated, and he had closed her fingers over it, and told her that whatever the world did, this was true, and the world could not touch it. Then he had ridden south to free himself, and she had begun to wait. He did not come back. What she learned afterward, in pieces, across 3 years. She did not learn all at once, and that is its own cruelty, the cruelty of a wound that opens slowly. Within a month of his leaving, her father took a fever from a sick parishioner he would not refuse to visit, and died in 9 days, and the parsonage passed to the new incumbent, and Idony was put out of the only house she had known with a small box of books and a folded certificate, and a girl named Olwen who would not leave her. Within the same season, word came north, carried by the kind of gossip that travels faster than honest news, that the Earl of Edenbrook had been gravely hurt. There had been a fall on his own grounds, a horse and a stone wall, and a blow to the head, and for many weeks he had not been expected to live. And when at last he did live, he was, they said, not entirely himself. He did not ride. He did not go into society. The aunt had taken the management of everything, the estate and the man both, and the man, by every account, let her Idony wrote. She wrote a careful letter that betrayed nothing to a reader who did not already know, a letter that only a man who loved her would understand, and she sent it to Edenmere, and waited, and no answer came. She wrote again. She wrote a 3rd time, and the 3rd letter came back to her unopened, refused at the door, and on the outside in an unfamiliar hand was written that the Earl received no correspondence, and that further letters would not be carried up. She understood then, or believed she understood, that the aunt stood between her and the only proof in the world that she was anyone at all, and that a married woman whose husband did not know her face from a stranger's was in law a wife and in life a ghost. She did not write again. Pride is a poor coat in winter, but it was the only one she had, and she wrapped it round herself and went out to earn her bread. She took a place as a governess. She was good at it, because she was clever and patient, and because children who cannot read a cloak read instead the steadiness of a person, and she was steady. She moved twice from a merchant's family to a baronet's, climbing by inches toward the world that had closed its door, telling no one what she was, keeping the certificate sewn into the lining of her workbox where no curious hand would find it. Olwen took a place as a seamstress in the same county, and they met when they could and did not speak of it, except that once a year, on a grey November afternoon, they walked out together to the edge of a field and stood a while and walked back, and that was all the morning either of them allowed. To the season, Idony Rayfield was a governess, and would die one. That was the first time she heard the verdict spoken aloud, said of her at a hiring house where she sat with her references in her lap, and a stout woman looked her over and pronounced, not unkindly, that a governess past 24 had best lower her hopes, for the world had its settled opinion of such women. Idony had thanked her for the place and said nothing. She had grown very good at holding her tongue. What no one in that room knew was that the thing the world believed she was not, and that the proof of it lay folded against her heart, and that she carried it not as a key to any door she still hoped to open, but as the last true thing in a life that had been emptied of everything else. So she did not understand, at first, why the name came back to her. She was 3 years a governess, and lately settled in the household of a kind, vague widow, when the county began to fill with a single piece of news, the kind that runs through drawing rooms as fire runs through dry grass. The Earl was to be married. He had recovered enough, and he had come at last into the neighborhood, taken up the seat at Edenmere that had stood half shut for 3 years, and he was to marry, and the bride was the niece of the great Dowager Marchioness of Hartsmere herself, who had managed his affairs through all his illness. The wedding was set for the spring. The bride was a young beauty of the Lawley family, named Sabriel, and Idony, hearing it across a tea-table while a child practiced scales in the next room, set down her cup with great care so that it should not rattle in the saucer, and understood that the man who could not unmake his marriage to her was about to make another, and that either he had forgotten her wholly, or he had been made to forget, and that in the eye of the law and of God, the new marriage would not be a marriage at all. It would be a bigamy. And the woman it most ruined would not be Idony, who was already ruined as far as the world could see. It would be Sabriel, who would believe herself a countess, and be in truth nothing, and any child of it nothing, and the whole edifice, a sham resting on a folded paper in a governess's workbox. She might have done nothing. She turned that over for a fortnight in the dark, and the doing nothing had a terrible sweetness to it, because doing nothing meant she need never go and look at his face and learn whether it knew her. Idony had been raised, however, by a man who took a fever rather than refuse a dying parishioner, and she found at the bottom of herself the same flat refusal to let a wrong go forward that she might have prevented. She did not go to expose him. She went to warn him. She wrote a final letter, plain and brief, asking only for the favor of a private quarter hour before the wedding went forward, signing it with her own name, and she gave it into the hand of Olwen Cruse, who, by good fortune, sewed now for a household 3 miles from Edenmere, and could carry it where a stranger could not. And the letter, as the others had, did not reach him. It reached his aunt. What passed in the dowager's morning room when that letter was laid before her, Idony did not see, but she would learn enough of it afterward to understand the shape of what she had walked into. The Dowager Marchioness of Hartsmere was not a stupid woman, and not, in the manner of the truly dangerous, a cruel one by temper. She believed entirely in the order she had been bred inside, believed that a great family is a thing held in trust against the carelessness of the men born to it, and that a girl of no fortune who had got a sick man to sign a paper in a country parish was precisely the sort of carelessness it was her duty to manage out of existence. She had built the Lawley match for 3 years, brick by brick through every month of her nephew's confusion, and she did not intend that it be undone by a governess. She read the letter twice, then she put it in the fire, and she sent for her niece, and she began to prepare a defense. Because the dowager understood, as Idony in her innocence had not, that a marriage may be true and still be defeated if the proof of it can be made to seem a lie. A certificate is paper. A clergyman who could swear to it was dead. A witness who was only a servant could be doubted, or paid, or frightened into silence. And so while Idony sewed and taught and gathered her courage, the dowager moved first. She made quiet enquiry into the parish, where the marriage had been solemnized, and found it conveniently scattered. The old clergyman dead, the register passed to indifferent successors. She let it be put about in the soft underground way that such things travel, that a desperate woman with a false paper might appear and make a scene, that the poor Earl in his fragile health was the natural prey of fortune hunters, that any document such a creature produced was to be pitied and disregarded. She prepared the ground so that when the truth stood up in the chapel, it would already have been named a lie before it spoke. That is what an antagonist who has the foresight to build a sham has the foresight to do. She did not leave her work unguarded. She set a watch on it. And she did one thing more, the cleverest and the cruelest. She procured a paper of her own. A certificate, drawn up to look aged, recording a marriage in a distant parish between a man of the Earl's former style and a woman long since dead, a paper meant to be produced if Idones was. A counterfeit to set against the truth, so that two papers might cancel each other in the public mind, and leave the lolly match standing on the rubble. It was a thin scheme, and it would not survive a court. It did not need to survive a court. It needed only to survive a single morning in a chapel full of people who wished to believe the bride and not the governess, and the dowager had every reason to think that it would. So when Idones stepped into the bar of light and said that she knew of a lawful impediment, she stepped into a trap that had been laid for her with patience and skill, and she did not know it yet. She knew only the faces. She made herself look at his face first, because she had told herself on the road that she would, that whatever it cost, she would look and know. The Earl had turned at last. He was thinner than the man who had named the bees, and there was a fine scar at his left temple that had not been there, the mark of the fall, and his face was the still, closed face the world had decided was coldness, and Idones had once known was only stillness over deep water. He looked at her. For one breath there was nothing in his eyes at all. The blank of a man shown a stranger, and Idones felt the floor of the world tilt under her, felt the 3 years drop away into a pit, because if he did not know her, then she had come here to wreck a wedding for a man who would thank his aunt for protecting him from her. Then something moved in the still face. It was very small. It was the smallest thing, a tightening at the corner of the jaw, a flicker low in the eyes as of the first stir of a banked fire, and it was gone before the room could see it. But Idones, who had once spent 11 evenings learning that face, saw it. He did not know her name in that instant. His body knew something his ruined memory had not yet given words to, and his hand, resting on the carved rail, had closed without his bidding. The Dowager Marchioness rose from the front pew. She was a tall woman who wore her age as rank, in gray silk and old diamonds, and she did not hurry, because hurry is for people who fear the outcome. She turned to face the back of the chapel, and she looked at Idones as a magistrate looks at a thing already convicted, and she said, in a voice pitched to carry to every pew, that she had feared this, that the parish had been warned of it, that here was the very woman, the fortune hunter, come to prey upon a sick man's confusion with a false paper, and that the congregation must not be distressed, for it had all been foreseen. To the chapel she said, "This person is no one." It was the second time the verdict was pronounced over Idones' head in a public room, and this time it was meant to be the last word, meant to close the matter before the matter could open. A murmur went through the pews, the low, ugly sound of a crowd deciding which way to fall. And it fell, as crowds fall, toward the woman in diamonds and away from the woman in gray. Idones stood very still under the high windows, and felt the room turn against her, felt how easy it had been, how little it had cost the dowager to do it, 3 sentences and a lifetime of consequence on her side of the scale. She might have wept, she might have shouted the truth and been carried out shouting it, which was precisely what the dowager wished, for a woman carried out shouting is a woman the room is glad to be rid of. Instead, Idones did the thing she had learned in 3 years of holding her tongue. She was still. She let the murmur run itself out against her stillness, as a wave breaks against a stone, and when it had spent itself into the silence she had made, she opened the leather case. She did not hold the certificate up as a banner. She had thought a great deal, on the road, about how a true thing should be offered, and she had decided the truth does not need to shout, that the shouting is what liars do. So she walked, unhurried, up the center of the chapel, between the staring pews, and she came to a stop a respectful distance from the altar, and she addressed herself not to the crowd and not to the dowager, but to the reverend, the one man in the room whose office it was to care whether a marriage was lawful. She said that she made no scene and asked no man to take her word. She said that a marriage had been solemnized 3 years before, in a named parish, by a named clergyman before named witnesses, one of whom yet lived and stood that morning outside the chapel door, and that here was the certificate, drawn in the late clergyman's hand and bearing his seal, and that she asked only that it be examined, as the law required any such claim to be examined, before the words went further. Then she laid the paper on the altar rail and stepped back, and put her hands behind her, and waited. It was the worst thing she could have done to the dowager's plan, and the dowager knew it at once, because a woman who screams can be dismissed, and a woman who quietly invites examination cannot. The Marchioness's face, for the first time, showed a hairline crack. She recovered in an instant and produced her own paper, the aged counterfeit, and laid it beside Idane's and said that there was the answer that the unfortunate creature's husband, if husband he could be called, had a wife already dead these many years, that the parish records would bear it out that the whole sad fraud collapsed of itself. 2 papers on the altar rail. The reverend looked from one to the other and did not know which to believe. And the room held its breath, and the trap closed, exactly as it had been built to close. Into that silence, the Earl spoke for the first time, and his voice was low and level and carried to the back wall. He said that he wished to see the witness. The dowager turned to him with the swiftness of real alarm, and for the length of a heartbeat the watching room saw something it was not meant to see, saw the manager forget herself, saw her put out a hand toward her nephew's sleeve, as one puts out a hand to stop a man stepping into the road. She told him he was unwell. She told him the strain was too much, that he must let her see to it, that he need not trouble himself with the woman, or her witness, or any of it. And the Earl looked down at the hand on his sleeve, the hand that had managed his fortune and his correspondence and his memory and his whole diminished life for 3 years, and Idane watched him look at it, as though he were seeing it from a great distance, and he removed it, gently, finger by finger, and said again that he wished to see the witness. Olwen Cruz came in from the porch, where she had waited, twisting her seamstress's hands in her apron, a small plain woman who had taught herself her letters late and was afraid of grand rooms, and who had come anyway, 3 miles on foot that morning because Idane had asked her and because some things are worth being afraid for. She came up the aisle with her chin level, though her hands shook, and she stood where the Reverend bid her stand, and she did not look at the diamonds or the gold silk. She looked at the certificate on the rail, and her plain face changed, and she said before anyone had asked her anything, that she knew that paper, that she had stood beside the lady when it was signed, that she had set her own name to it in her own hand, the square, careful letters, and that if the gentleman would turn it over he would find a small mark of ink below her name, where she had pressed too hard from nervousness, a stain she had wept over for spoiling the page on so great a day, and that no forger in the world could have known to put it there. The Reverend turned the paper over. The stain was there. It is a small thing, a spot of spilt ink. Yet the room had been waiting for something it could not doubt, and a tear of ink made by a frightened girl 3 years gone, sworn to before it was looked for, was a thing the room could not doubt, and the room knew it. The murmur came again, but it had changed direction. The dowager heard it change. She moved then to her second line, the counterfeit certificate, and pressed it on the Reverend, demanding it be weighed equally, and the Reverend, an honest and now thoroughly frightened man, said that it must all be looked into properly, that he could not in conscience proceed that morning, that the marriage could not go forward until the matter was tried, which was in the end all Idane had come to ask, not victory, only that a wrong be stopped before it was done. The morning was not finished with her, however, and neither was the dowager, who had not built 3 years of work to be undone by a seamstress and a spot of ink. She turned from the Reverend, whom she could no longer move, to the crowd, whom she still might, and she made her last cast, and it was the cruelest thing said in that chapel all day. She said into the turning room, that even were there once some country ceremony, what of it? What was it now? She said the woman had not been seen near the Earl in 3 years, had not been acknowledged, had not been kept, had no settlement, no establishment, no child, nothing but a paper and a story, and that a marriage abandoned in every true sense was no marriage that need bind a great house, that the law had remedies, that a quiet setting aside would put it all right, the wedding might go forward within the season once the unpleasantness was managed. She had reduced Idony, in 3 sentences, to a technicality to be cleared away. She had said, in effect and before 200 people, that the governess was nothing, had always been nothing, and might be made officially nothing, with a little patience and a little money. And the dreadful thing was that the room, which a moment before had turned toward the truth, wavered again, because the dowager had named the very fear every soul in it carried, the fear that worth without fortune is not worth at all, that a person the world has not kept is a person who does not count. Idony felt it land. This was the lowest hour of the day, lower than the moment she had feared he would not know her, because this was the moment the truth was admitted and dismissed in the same breath, the moment she understood that being right was not enough, that she could win the paper and lose the man and the world both, that she would be allowed to be technically a wife and practically erased, and that the dowager would call it mercy. She looked at the 2 papers lying there, with the proven stain between them, and felt how little they weighed against 3 sentences, and she did the only thing left that was hers to do. She spoke for the first time to the room, and her voice was not loud, and it did not shake. And what she said was the one true thing she had never let herself say in 3 years. She said that she had never asked to be kept. She said she had asked for nothing in all that time, had taken wages and taught other women's children, and sewn her own gloves, and had come this morning not to claim a fortune or a title or a husband who did not know her face, but to stop a good woman being made a bigamist's wife in a church, and that she would go back to her place and her wages, and ask nothing, still, only that no one in that room call her a liar over a thing that was true. Then she stopped, because she had said all of it, and the saying had emptied her, and she stood with her hands behind her, and waited for the room to do what rooms do. What happened next happened in the Earl of Edenbrook, and the room only watched it. He had been standing very still through all of it, the still, closed face the world called coldness, and across that morning something had been moving in him that no one could see, and Idony could not let herself hope for. A scar at the temple is a wound to the head, and a hurt to the head takes from a man what it chooses, and gives back what it chooses. And it had taken the names from him, the names and the dates and the one face he had ridden 11 evenings to learn. It had not taken the man. It had not taken whatever it is in a person that is older than memory. And that thing had stirred when she walked in, and had closed his hand on a carved rail, and had made him take his aunt's fingers from his sleeve. And now, as Idony finished and fell silent, he crossed the room. That was all. He did not make a speech, because the man Idony had married was not a maker of speeches, and the morning did not need one. He came down from the altar past the bride in her gold silk, past the dowager in her diamonds, past the reverend and the 2 papers, and he walked the length of the chapel to the place where the light reached the woman in gray. And the whole congregation turned in its pews to follow him, and the only sound was his boots on the stone. He stopped before her. He looked at her face as a man looks at a thing he has been trying to remember for 3 years, as a man looks at the answer to a question that has been aching in him since he woke from a fall, not entirely himself. And then he reached out and took her hand, the bare hand, for she had drawn off her glove without knowing she did it, and he said her name, Idony. He said it as her father had said it, and no one had said it since, as a name is said by someone to whom it means a whole person and not a station, and at the sound of it in his voice the 3 years broke in her as ice breaks on a river in the first warm wind, all at once, with a sound only she could hear. He did not remember the parish or the date or the names of the bees. He told her so afterward, in the quiet, that those were gone and might not come back. He had remembered, even so, the one thing the fall and the aunt and the 3 managed years had not been able to take, which was that this was his wife, and that he had known it the instant she stepped into the light, before he had a name for the knowing. and that everything since had been the slow work of letting his body teach his ruined mind a thing it had never doubted. He turned then, still holding her hand, and he spoke to the room, and it was the only thing he said to all of them, and it was 12 words, and it was enough. This is my wife. There will be no other wedding here. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at his aunt as he said it, which was its own mercy and its own verdict, for to have looked would have been to make a spectacle of her undoing, and he had no wish to. He said the 12 words into the center of the chapel and let them fall where they would, and they fell on a room that had at last made up its mind, and the murmur that rose this time was not ugly. It was the sound of 200 people relieved to find themselves on the side of the truth, after all. Glad to have been brought there, willing now to forget they had ever wavered. The Dowager Marchioness of Hartsmere did not faint, and did not rage, because she was not a woman of the kind that faints or rages, and the rind of her dignity held even as the floor went out from under it. She stood very straight in her gray silk and her old diamonds, and Idony, watching her, saw the calculation go on behind the still face even now, saw her measure the room and the Reverend and her nephew's hand closed around the governess's hand, and saw her understand, in a single cold instant, that the game was lost, not by accident, but by being beaten, that the truth had been better defended than her lie. And something happened in the Dowager's face that Idony had not expected and would think about for a long time after. It was not hatred. It was a kind of terrible recognition, the look of a person who has been certain her whole life of the value of a thing, and has just been shown in a room full of witnesses that the thing she was certain of is not the thing that matters. Her categories had measured Idony and found her nothing, and her categories had been wrong, and she was old enough and clever enough to know that being wrong, at her age, in public, was a kind of death she would not recover from quickly. She inclined her head a fraction to her nephew. Then she gathered her niece by the wrist and went out by the side door, not in flight, but in the manner of a general quitting a field she has the sense to know is lost, and the chapel let her go. Sabriel Lawley, going out on her aunt's arm in her gold silk, looked back once. She was not a wicked woman, only a woman who had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, raised to a match as a plant is raised to a wall, and she had believed it because everyone had told her to, and she had not known until this morning that the man she was to marry had a wife. Idony saw that in her face as she looked back, the dawning understanding that she too had been used, that her aunt had meant to make her a bigamist's wife as surely as Idony had come to prevent it, that the Dowager had been willing to spend her niece's whole future to win. There was no triumph in Idony at the sight of it. The part of her heart that had braced for years to hate these people found at the last that it could not, found only that the girl in gold had been lied to as thoroughly as anyone, and that the thing to feel was not victory, but a strange, grave pity. Sabriel held her look a moment, then she went out, and the door closed, and the gold silk was gone. They were married 3 weeks afterward, Idony and her earl, in the small, cold church, 3 counties distant, where they had been married once before, because he said when she told him of it that he wished to stand in the place where the thing he could not remember had been true, and to make it true again in a way he would keep. Her father was not there to do it this time, but the new incumbent did it kindly, and Olwen Crewe stood up as witness a second time and signed her square, careful name a second time, and this time she did not spill the ink. And she wept anyway, and so did Idony. And the Earl held her hand through all of it as though he had been waiting 3 years to do exactly that which he had. The Dowager Marchioness did not come, and was not asked, and was not in the end ruined, for the Earl would not have it. When the lawyers wished to make an example of her over the counterfeit paper, he refused, and Idony, asked her wish, refused with him. And the matter was let drop, and the Dowager kept her diamonds and her consequence, and went to live very quietly at a property in the north, and was spoken of afterward as a great lady, grown reclusive in her age. It was not mercy of the soft kind. It was the harder mercy of people who have decided that the breaking of an enemy adds nothing to the keeping of a love, and who would rather spend their strength on the second than the first. The dowager understood it, in her way, and once, in the second year, sent a short stiff letter of correct congratulation on the birth of an heir, and Idony answered it kindly, and that was all, and it was enough. As for the governess who would die a governess, the county that had decided what she was learned to call her Your Ladyship, and did so with the smooth speed of a world that has always been on the right side of everything. And she let it, because she had stopped long ago, expecting the world's verdict to be the true one. The truth had been in her workbox the whole time, sewn into the lining where no one looked, a folded paper with a frightened girl's spilt ink below a careful square name. And the truth had not changed for being unseen, and it did not need the county's leave to be true. That was the thing she carried out of the chapel at Norrie's Cross that showed on no certificate. The world's not seeing of a person is not the same as that person not being there. If you have stayed with her this far, perhaps you have known what it is to be a true thing the world has decided to read as a small one, and to carry your truth folded and unseen, and wait. I hope if you have that you are nearer your own morning of light than you fear. She kept the certificate. Not in the workbox any longer, for there was no more need to hide it, but folded inside the cover of the book of Virgil her father had taught her from, the same volume the lean, tired traveler had argued with her across a country hearth on the first of 11 evenings, on a gray November afternoon in the second year of her marriage. With an heir asleep upstairs, and the fires lit against the cold, and her husband reading by the window in the failing light, Idony took the book down and opened the cover and looked at the folded paper, at the mark of ink at her father's hand. Almeric looked up from his own page and asked her what she had there, for the names of that day were still gone from him and might always be. She crossed the warm room and put the open book in his lap and showed him, and his thumb moved over the spot of ink as it had moved on it that morning in the chapel, and he was quiet a long moment in the firelight. Then he closed the book gently over the paper and set it on the table between them, where it could stay. Now, in the daylight, unfolded as often as they pleased, and he drew her down beside him, and outside the first snow of the season began to fall past the window onto the dark grounds of Eatonmere, and neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left in the world that needed proving.